Well, hello everyone. Welcome to session 7. And session 7 is about teaching methods, which is important for us to discuss and go through. Everybody has a preferred teaching method as a teacher, but most teachers use a combination of methods. It isn't one size fits all. There are some students who respond to some teaching methods, and some teachers prefer different styles. So in this session, we're going to go through a few of the more common teaching methods, but let's just do a recap. You have just watched the video called 50s Education, and you've watched a man teach a lesson from the 1950s. And I can tell you, it's a real eye-opener, isn't it? So much of education is still the same. Good teaching is always good teaching. And you would have seen this man, this teacher, who has used what we call explicit instruction. Sometimes it's called, and you'll see this in your textbook, it's called exploratory teaching. So exploratory teaching and explicit instruction are the same term. Now, it's more of a traditional style of learning. It's interesting to note that all of the schools that do very well in international competitions, in the PISA competitions, are taught by exploratory methods. So what is exploratory instruction? Well, exploratory instruction is where the teacher teaches a skill or a concept to the whole class. And so the teacher engages the students, they sit, they listen, there's a demonstration, and the teacher explains step by step a procedure or a skill. Then, after the teacher has explained the skill, there's careful questioning. The children are then given the opportunity to demonstrate their learning. There's also some guided practice until the children perfect the skill, and then they're given opportunity for independent practice. Now, you may have been at school and this was your schooling, all of your lessons, but I can say that exploratory instruction does rely on the teacher knowing their content very well, but also being able to watch for students who are struggling. Most problems with exploratory instruction are when the students do not know how to read. And I will say that most instruction is underpinned by the students having good literacy skills. That's why reading is so important. Maths becomes difficult if we can't read. Most lessons become difficult if we can't read. If we can't read a teacher's instruction or listen to instructions, then learning becomes very problematic. And so the benefits of exploratory teaching are that all of the students learn the same material. But of course, there are students who are going to get it quicker and some who are going to get it, need repetition and need a few more examples. And so that's when, in the guided practice, the teacher can start to have a look at some individualization of students, who needs more practice, who can then go on to do independent work. This is a skill, and good teachers are on the lookout for how students are learning. There are a few advantages to this method, but there's a few disadvantages. So I'd like you to turn to page 173 and let's have a look at what are some of the problems when a student has learning difficulties. And halfway down the page, it says, when a whole class method, it does not easily take into account individual differences among learners, such as prior knowledge, language background, literacy skills, experience, attention span, or motivation. If used too frequently or without adequate active participation by students, it can lead to boredom and disengagement. Exploratory methods usually require learners to have adequate linguistic and study skills, in particular good listening and vocabulary skills, adequate reading, comprehension and functional writing skills, and these are often prerequisites and are often poorly developed in students with learning difficulties. And students with learning difficulties often lack confidence and assertiveness, so they're very unlikely to raise their hand and say they don't understand or have a question. So it's very rare that a teacher would just use exploratory instruction. They may start the lesson with exploratory instruction, but then they would integrate other student-centered approaches. And the good thing about that is that when the teacher knows that they've got to integrate self-directed and student-centered approaches, they then will be able to individualize instruction. So I'll give you an example. A teacher wants to have a lesson in telling the time. Now, a teacher would get a clock out, digitally or analog, but most of the students are going to be at different levels of telling the time. So the teacher will take the whole class, she would ask questions about o'clock time, about half hours, about quarter hours, and 5-minute intervals. Now, the students who know the answers or can do o'clock and half time and quarter time would not be asked questions regarding 5-minute intervals. The teacher does need to know the individual skills of each of the children so that the lesson becomes meaningful and in itself is self-directed, but also individualized in when the teacher teaches the lesson. Then at the end of the lesson, there's a recap and the teacher can go through the time for everyone. It's important not to single out students with disabilities too much. Let them be part of the lesson, because if we keep on withdrawing them from the main lesson, they then feel that there's something wrong with them, that they don't belong, that they are deficit, and we need as much as possible to be including them in the main lesson. So that's the first one. Next one I would like to talk about is interactive whole class teaching. Now, interactive whole class teaching has many of the same elements of exploratory teaching, but with this whole class interactive teaching, it's very fast paced and we're getting the children to be more active in answering questions. So there'll be a presentation and the teacher will ask, not do you understand, because if you ask a child, do you understand, they're always going to say yes or no, but they're going to ask them to give specific answers. So there might be a lesson on counting and the teacher might say, we're going to be counting to 10, and so when I point to you, I want you to tell me the next number in sequence. So the teacher might go 1, 2, point to a student, and the student have to say 3, and point to another student 4, and the teacher might say 5, 6, point to another student. And so as much as possible, the children are engaged in the lesson because they know that they're expected to give an answer. This whole class interactive teaching is not just for young students, but for older students too. But it's a way of gaining the students' attention, and they know that they will be totally engaged in the lesson. In Britain, this is now being used to teach literacy and numeracy in primary schools. But the important thing about the interactive approach is it's got to be very fast-paced. The teacher has to know their sequencing and their content and be able at all times to maintain the motivation of the children. The children love the lesson, but the lessons can't usually go more than 15 to 20 minutes because it's quite exhausting at the end for the teacher to be on that questioning all the time. But let's look at page 174, and let's see some of the things we have to consider with the interactive whole class teaching. The teacher needs to be very skillful in drawing all students into the discussion, and the lesson has to be interactive, fast-paced, and difficult to implement and sustain. And the last point, if the pace of the lesson is too quick, students with learning difficulties fall behind. But I can also say that some students who have severe anxiety do find this interactive approach very threatening, because they're on tenterhooks the whole time. They think, oh my goodness, the teacher's going to ask me, and they become very, very stressed. Do you remember the film that we saw with Rick LaVoy in Fat City? He said to the students, when I'm going to ask you a question, I'm going to stand next to you so that you know that you can be prepared for the answer, but also that when I walk away from you, you can relax. I'm not going to ask you a question. I think it's really important to remember the level of anxiety that some of our students may face in a lesson, and to have those the strategies in place to make sure the children are relaxed, because a high level of anxiety will not enable them to learn to their best potential. Let's look at the next teaching method that we've got. And can't find it. And here we go. Direct instruction. Oh, my favorite. Direct instruction. Why do I love direct instruction? Because it's usually so happy for the students. They love it. And most of the research around direct instruction says that it works. And so when I get a lesson in direct instruction, I have a sequence of what I'm supposed to say. This teacher has the teacher handbook. The students have the student workbook. It's engaging. It's in very small sequence steps. And the students love it. I can also say that some teachers hate it. They think it stifles their creativity, and they don't want to use it. They skip lessons and think they don't need to do this lesson, and look, I'm falling behind in my curriculum time. How about I just miss out lesson 112, 113, and now go straight on to 114 because I'm behind in my teaching time. We can't do that. And so teachers have to embrace, if we're going to use direct instruction, we're going to use it the way it was intended, the way it was developed, the way it was researched. And it does work. So it's usually small groups. The students are in about 9 or 10. The teacher will have like a presentation book. The students will have a workbook. The teacher will read. There'll be certain responses. It might be something like, say after me, And of course the students are going to say, Say after me, And the students will say, Now let's blend You blend And so when the students are given that direct instruction, they're actually giving us direct feedback. We know whether or not they have understood the lesson. And the other thing is that when the students are giving us this feedback, we can see those who are getting the lesson and those who are not. That's very helpful for us. So at the end of the lesson, we can write down which students are struggling and where they're struggling, because these lessons in the direct instruction approach are so sequenced that we're being able to very fine-tune the diagnosis of the student's reading or literacy problem. Now, I have used direct instruction in reading, in number, and in spelling, and also language. And I found when I had some students with moderate disabilities that they loved it. Students with mild disabilities, intellectual, loved it as well. And little children in kindy and year 1 love it as well. I think it's not the whole approach that we have to use, but I think it's one approach that we have to use and know that this approach works, but we have to use it the right way. It's a bit like using a recipe. If you change the recipe, you're not going to get the desired results. This is the way it works, by using the approach as outlined in the instructional material. So what is the problem with DI? What do we need to consider? Well, we need to consider that it has to be done every day. It's only a method that will continue to be repeated. Some teachers find that difficult to find time in the day, but they need to. So, direct instruction, my favorite.